we have now gathered 300 stories, and I would say every single story is just mind-bogglingly courageous. The people are full of dignity, and despite the setbacks, many of them actually are very reluctant to talk about any kind of discrimination they suffered when clearly these 80 and 90-year-olds grew up under Jim Crow or worse, and yet they did not want to talk about it.
Hi there, welcome to another episode of Chinatown 2.0, an interview podcast where we explore the stories, ideas, and actions of global citizens with Chinese heritage. I'm your host, Richard Yan. Today we're interviewing Professor Anne Chao, a Chinese modern historian that lectures at Rice University. She is also manager of the Houston Asian American Archive, an oral history archive that looks to document the challenges faced and contributions made by the Asian American community. As the daughter of a Taiwanese diplomat, as a kid, Anne moved between Congo, Australia, Washington, D.C., and Taiwan. Her Ph.D. dissertation was on the social networks of Chen Duxiu, co-founder of the Chinese Communist Party and publisher of the influential magazine Xin Qingnian, or New Youth. In this interview, we covered her multi-continental childhood, views on Asians' involvement in politics, a history of discrimination suffered by Asian Americans, inspiring stories from the Houston Asian American Archive, and her work on Chen Duxiu. As usual, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell on our YouTube channel. Hope you enjoy this episode. Hi, Anne. Good morning. Thanks for joining our show, Chinatown 2.0.
Good morning, Richard. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be on your show.
Thank you. Thank you. So could you please briefly introduce yourself? Where are you from? Where have you lived? Tell us about your profession and what you're passionate about.
Sure. I'm trained as a modern Chinese historian. I'm also currently manager of the Houston Asian American Archive, an oral history archive that we will be talking about later. I was born in Taipei, Taiwan, and my father was a diplomat for the Chinese government on Taiwan, for the Nationalist Party. And so when I was 10 years old, he was assigned abroad. And so I stopped going to Chinese school in Taiwan in fourth grade. And then his first assignment was in Congo, Africa. After that, we did come to United States in Washington, D.C. He was in the embassy for a year. So I attended seventh grade in an American junior high school. Then went back to Taipei, and I graduated from high school in Australia and attended college in the US. Since then, I married my husband after college, so following him and his family, we've been in and out of the US, but we have now been in Houston since for about 30 some years. I did finish, I majored in Chinese studies in college. I did go to grad school, but could not finish because my husband's career sent him abroad, back to Taiwan, until about 2001, 19 years ago, when I returned to Rice University to pick up my Ph.D. studies and obtained my Ph.D. in 2009, and then stayed on to teach there as an adjunct. My other title at Rice University is adjunct lecturer in the humanities. At the same time, I started the archive with the director of our Asian Studies Center. And then, so this is part of my work as well.
Thank you for that introduction. So of all the places that you have lived in your childhood, which places left the strongest impression in you?
I think everywhere I went, I learned something new. I developed certainly a huge respect for the culture of that country. And also watching my father's practice, if you will, I think left me a great curiosity about people who move around, about immigration in general.
Right. So are there schools dedicated to kids of diplomats in each respective place?
No, you actually enter a local school. At the time,
Okay.
the countries, well, in Washington, D.C., of course, you just went to a public school. In Congo, there were no school for diplomats. It was a local French school. And in Australia, again, I went to an Australian school. There were some children diplomats in there, but it was a totally Australian school.
I see. So talk about the transition between these different places in terms of picking up a new language and having to say goodbye to your friends, not knowing when you're going to return, because that wasn't the time of Facebook or Twitter.
Exactly. So you basically just, you jump into a situation and either you sank or you swam. Going to Congo, I was in finishing fourth grade in Taipei, but I was put back in first grade in that school because I couldn't speak French. So I was the tallest kid sitting in the back. But then within a year, I caught up and I went back to fourth grade, so I was a year behind. Again, and then coming to Washington D.C., I had to have a Chinese, well, basically English French dictionary and a French Chinese dictionary in order to understand what's going on in seventh grade. Excuse me. Luckily, my mother spoke English very well, so she would help out a lot with the homework assignment. And I think within a year, I was able to catch up. There was a hiatus when my father went back to Taipei to work for 3 years. And at that point, I told my father, within 3 or 4 years, you took me from a Chinese school to a French school to an English school. I need just one language to finish my high school. So he said, well, you choose. And I thought English is easier at that point than Chinese. So I did go to Taipei American School for about 2 years. But my father said, the only condition is that you get tutored in Chinese culture on weekends. So I had a tutor to teach me Chinese philosophy, Chinese poetry. I even took up Chinese painting because my father did not want me to forget Chinese culture. And then going to Australia from American school in Taipei, the system is very different, especially in science. For instance, in American school, you get 1 full year of biology, I think in ninth grade, 1 full year of chemistry, 1 full year of physics. But in Australia, they start building your foundation by giving a little bit of biology, chemistry, and physics in eighth grade and ninth grade, or they call, they have form 1, form 2, form 3, form 4, so that by the time you reach form 5 and form 6, which is the equivalent of 11th and 12th grade, you have a solid grounding in all three science subjects. And then at that point, you're divided into a science track and a more humanities track. And then when you take your exams for universities, you are already you've already chosen your major, basically, by the time you go to university, and the 3-year university system. So basically, you juggle. And when you're in a situation where you're faced with absolutely no time to prepare and no system where you can go to something like ESL or something, you just did what you can.
Of all these places you've been to, it sounds like Congo is the one that's not developed. Do you think there was a systemic difference in terms of your education there versus the Western counterparts?
Not really. It could be because Congo just gained its independence. So the school I went to was a French school, and it was a French school designed for children of the oil companies, because Shell Oil has a huge presence in Congo. And so all of my classmates were French. I think there was one Congolese student in my class. And so we basically followed a French curriculum, and I did get a solid grounding in French grammar and French literature and French geography. So I don't think that the quality at the time suffered, because it was 1961 or 62, when their infrastructure is still very colonial, even though politically it just gained its independence.
And what decade was this? Was this in the 70s? 60s? Okay, I see. I'm always fascinated about how American high schools around the world are able to teach their kids everything about the language, the culture, to such an extent that kids that graduate from those programs and enroll in American universities, they're practically indistinguishable from locals that have grown up in the US. And yet you talk to them and they tell you they don't even have a driver's license in America. And people just assume they're from LA or from New York, from these metropolitan areas, because they're so culturally sophisticated, educated, and suave. And yet they tell you they actually grew up in South Korea or in a country in Africa. So it really sounds like these international schools sort of had their roots or their role models back even in the 60s, where you could have these French schools all the way in Congo.
Yes, definitely. And I think I totally agree with you that I have taught students at Rice who just arrived from China. And yet you can barely tell that they are from China. They blend in right away. And I think maybe because the social media is another influence that we didn't have when we were growing up. but it wasn't easy. I mean, trying to adjust to different language, different culture wasn't easy. And I remember just spending hours studying or trying to figure out how to write an essay in a language that you barely learned 3 months ago. Um,
Right,
these days, with the kind of international school in the countries that, in Korea, for instance, or in Hong Kong or in Taipei, you're basically attending almost like a private school in America with the
right.
quality of the curriculum.
So, with such a globalist childhood, how do you feel about the state of the world right now, where it just seems that at least two out of the various countries where you grew up, America and Australia, seem to be moving away from a globalist stance, at least in relation to their connections with one of the largest economies in the world, namely China?
I think that I'm looking at more of a historian. It is very concerning what is happening, the nativist sentiment or the nationalism that's arising in all the countries. But it's almost a cliche as a historian to say that the pendulum swings and that there's a cyclical nature to history. But it does seem to have, uh, we've now turned back on internationalism, on globalism, on liberalism, and we are now, and I think the economic situation is such that it's causing a lot of people to question whether it is a good idea to belong to an international system. Look at EU and Britain with Brexit. People are concerned, and I think the economic factor is the main driving force. Without, if the economy around the country, around the world, in all those countries is solid and good, I think people are much more willing to be open abroad about people and countries abroad. But once the economy goes down, people's minds close, people's doors close.
Right, right on, right on. So, by the way, you mentioned the word liberalism. I've heard that term a lot, and I've heard people debate between liberalism and populism. Can you define in your own terms liberalism and also maybe juxtapose it against populism, if that is the right differentiation?
Well, I think I use liberalism more in the sense of a democracy with open legal system, with a constitution very much like the US. Populism to me is more of a nativist sentiment in that you have people who are disenfranchised from a liberal state like the US. The people who feel their voices are not heard, there's absolutely no recourse to any kind of support. And the only thing they can do is to demonstrate on the street in order to get their voices heard. To me, that's more of a populist sentiment. A liberal state, to me, we're still talking about the kind of European philosophers of the 18th and 19th century. So I would say, for instance, the Black Lives Matter movement is a populist sentiment. It grew from the people. It is out of frustration, out of anger, that so many things are unjust and unfair and that have not been addressed in a liberal state like the US.
Yeah, it sounds like a liberal state and populist sentiment can coexist. So you mentioned Black Lives Matter. So this is a nice segue into your work because a lot of what you do has to do with race in America. Tell us a little bit about your view of the recent racial movements such as BLM, and how do you think that intersects with the life of a Chinese American or Taiwanese American? And how does that intersect with the work that you do as a historian and academician?
So the Black Lives Movement, I think because of the killing of George Floyd, the intensity is what caught the public's imagination, that the rumbling really started now. But I think the Asian Americans, because of our liminal situation in the society, have never really looked closely. We all feel that we suffer discrimination, yes, but have we done much about it? I'm not sure. I think we have pockets of perhaps dissension, but we've never as a group come together to say, yes, there's huge discrimination. We need to do something about it. I think most of the reaction I hear are people, yes, they acknowledge discrimination, but they buckle down to work harder in order to win, if you will, or in order to gain whatever advantage that they can, but they're not there to confront the mainstream society, if you will. But I think Black Lives Movement has really forced the Asian American community introspection that, in a sense, what are we doing here? Are we first of all, are we also the cause of this kind of suppression? Are we also biased, and are we also adding to the discrimination in the BLM movement? And on the other hand, we also as a minority have suffered discrimination. Should we voice it? So I think it's a moment of reckoning for the Asian American community. And then I think the reaction varies across the spectrum.
You mentioned that we all seem to suffer from discrimination in this country. Could you go into that in a little bit more detail as to what form of discrimination are Asian Americans facing in this country that are unique to Asians, perhaps?
So in my work, I have to dabble into immigration history in order to understand when the Chinese came to the United States. And we all know the Chinese came during the gold rush. And then when the gold rush dried up, they moved on to railroad work. And then when the railroad work dried up, they basically, many of them came down to the South. And when they came to the South, they replaced some of the laborers that were missing from emancipation. So they worked on cotton plantations or sugarcane plantations. And of course, as a side, the Chinese were not willing to sustain the kind of harsh conditions. So many of them eventually left plantation, and they gathered pool enough money to start small grocery stores or laundromats. As they were working we're talking mid 19th century until early 20th century. And many of the people in Texas and Houston, Chinese Americans, came this way. But when you look at the immigration law, the first immigration law came down against the Chinese in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act. So if you were Irish American, you came through, Staten Island through the eastern side of the United States, there was no immigration law. But if you came through Angel Island, you have all kinds of restrictions on you. So exclusion law, as we all know, barred Chinese men who are not diplomats, students, or merchants from coming in. Even though earlier, there was actually Ensign Burlingame, a retired US diplomat, negotiated with the Chinese government to bring in Chinese labor to make up for the shortage of emancipated slaves. So all of that.
But you said Chinese men, sorry to interrupt. So Chinese women are allowed in, but Chinese men aren't as part of the Exclusion Act?
No, Chinese women were not allowed in due to the Angel Act. The Angel Act is an act that required women to prove that they were not prostitutes. So they were basically proven they were judged guilty before their innocence. And I think one of the reasons that Chinese men usually have more than one wives, and therefore if you already have a Mrs. Wong in the United States and you came in through Angel Island and you claim I'm Mrs. Wong, the officers were, well, there already is a Mrs. Wong. You either must be a mistress or someone else, and therefore you're not allowed in. So the design is to keep the Chinese community, mainly male, as a kind of so that you cannot have families, you cannot settle down here. So from the Exclusion Act, there was a Geary Act, and then there was a 10-year extension and a further 10-year extension. So the immigration law became extremely restrictive on Chinese Americans. When this happened, the Japanese laborers came to step in and fill some of the void vacated by the Chinese labor. And Japan was a very strong country in the early 20th century. And the US actually depended on Japan as a naval partner in the Pacific Ocean. So the Japanese people who came in here had the Japanese government support, and they were given much better treatment than the Chinese. The Chinese came in without the Qing government's approval, and therefore there was no governmental support behind the Chinese labor. But very soon, the Japanese earned ire of the American, basically white male laborers. And so there was a gentleman's agreement by the two governments where the US will accord certain treatment privileges to the Japanese immigrants, but Japan would voluntarily restrict immigration of the Japanese coming to the country. So when the Japanese laborers dried up, the Indian Americans kind of stepped in. But then very soon there was a different immigration law where there was an Asiatic a zone where India and South Asia and other Southeast Asian countries were restricted in that area where immigrants were not allowed in. So in the immigration law, the Asians were subject to discrimination, unlike all the other white white immigrants. So that's one. The other is the naturalization and marriage miscegenation law, anti-miscegenation laws. So the Chinese, not being white and not being black, were not allowed to get citizenship unless you were born in this country. So that's another, and if you don't have citizenship, there are a lot of jobs you cannot apply for. For instance, in Texas, if you want to be a cotton plantation worker, that's fine. Go and pick cotton, go and do sugarcane work, which is backbreaking work with very little pay. But if you want to weigh cotton, which is a better paid job and not as hardworking, you have to have proof of citizenship. In Texas, there was a famous case with Judge Roy Bean. He actually is a judge who operates out of a bar. He was facing a case of judging an Irish worker who had killed a Chinese worker. The friends of this Irish worker were outside the bar, threatened to tar and feather the judge had he ruled against the Irish worker. So he basically made this very famous pronouncement where, there are laws against killing a fellow countryman in this country, but there are no laws against killing a Chinaman, case closed. So these are all instances where the Asians, and the Chinese in particular I'm talking about now, but the Asians were all facing discrimination. The worst part is the lack of determination of your legal status.
Got it. So which decades are you talking about in the 20th century when it's around this history?
So 1882 is exclusion law. All of these laws did not get repealed until 1943. When China entered the World War II as an ally of the US had to accord its citizens in this country better treatment. So that's when the exclusion law was completely repealed in 1943. The repeal of these laws were not, for Japan, for India, for the Philippines, were completely different years, but it came after 1943. But after these exclusion laws were repealed, especially in the South, there's something called Jim Crow laws. The Jim Crow laws were basically designed by the white society, as you know, to keep the African Americans who are free now from having equal attainment to privileges.
Employment opportunities.
Right, and zoning laws. In fact, where I live, the deed restriction was that you're not allowed, non-whites were not allowed to purchase property until 1984. So, and the last anti-miscegenation law, where you're not allowed to marry a non-white, was not repealed in 1965 in one of the states. Anti-miscegenation law has had its history in different states at different times, but the last state to repeal this law was not until 1965. So there are all of these, I would say, hidden rocks that you don't know until you bump into it to see what kind of discriminations are there for non-whites, especially for Asians.
By the way, so you mentioned the word what is that word again? Could you say it again?
Oh,
you said
miscegenation.
Miscegenation?
That is a law against marrying non-whites, for whites to marry non-whites.
Okay, I have never heard that word before.
Oh, yeah. Well, it was designed really for whites not to marry African Americans. And so in some states where there's a larger percentage of Asians, that law is written into the state law against Asian, against Malaysians, Chinese, they would name them. In certain states, there weren't enough Chinese, so the non-white only applied to African American, not to Asians. In New York, for instance, there was not a single mention. There's no anti-miscegenation law against Asians. So it varies from state to state.
I think we can probably agree that there's much less racial discrimination institutionally or societally today than the periods that you mentioned. But I do sense that in general, there's a lack of Asian participation in trying to change the narrative for Asians or for other races when it comes to discriminatory practices or discriminatory rhetorics. Do you agree that Asians generally participate less? And if so, why do you think that's the case?
Oh, I totally agree. I totally agree. The Asians in our party, you don't see them in many of the places where we should have our voice heard. And I think it's a cultural thing. Immigrants came here because they're escaping something, mainly from home country. Many of them escaped the political situation in their home country, and they're very, very distrustful of politicians. Even my father-in-law, not my father, but my father-in-law had told my husband, I would not go into politics. It's just too dangerous.
Is your husband's father from China?
He's from China. So you can tell because he grew up at the time when China was deciding, or if you will, between being communist and nationalist. Or basically, it was the battle between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, right? And that is my own study of Chinese history really centered on a period right before the country split into the two camps. And I'm thinking, if you and I, who are hopefully thinking people, live in China during those tumultuous times, we all may have stayed in China and become a communist, because the communists were promising justice, whereas the Nationalist Party was openly corrupt. But my father-in-law decided to leave mainland China and went to Taiwan, and so did my father. So I did ask them, why did you all not stay in China and become a communist and save the country, as many people we knew did? My father-in-law said, I personally witnessed the kind of things that the Chinese communists did in my hometown. I don't trust them. My father, I think, went to university and then found a job with Chiang Kai-shek's government. So his fate was decided because that's where he could find a job. So I think many people are very leery of being in politics, just because the political situation in China and where they come for the Chinese is so unstable and so dangerous. So when they came to this country, all they want to do is to find a good livelihood and basically keep their head down and not make a noise. That worked, I think, for the first generation immigrants. But I think now, as Asian Americans realize that if you do not participate in politics, your voice won't be heard. This country, for all its faults, still allows more democratic participation than other countries around the world.
Absolutely. I mean, basically, if you don't show up to the voting booth, you forfeit by construction, right? And I guess participation in the political process isn't just about voting, though. It's also about rallying, protesting. It's about writing, communicating, donating, and so on and so forth. So I do sense that there is a pivot in terms of the attitude for more modern generations of Asian Americans than their ancestors.
Yeah.
So I'm actually really curious, from a genealogy standpoint, given any Asian person in America today, where can you trace their earliest entry into this country in terms of their family tree? Does that make sense? So like for me, the first person to come into America is myself. I mean, my dad did do part of his studies here, but he's never really an immigrant, right? So for me, I'm the beginning of the tree, if you will. But for many others, it's not, right? You hear about fourth generation Japanese Americans or third generation Chinese Americans. So I'm really curious if someone has ever done this kind of genealogy mapping where we can say, okay, 20% of Chinese ethnic people in this country actually came from the railroad work immigrants and so on and so forth. I mean, is there a study available somewhere?
That is a really good question. I know that if you go on ancestry.com, you can actually find the ship record of people who landed on California, because I was tracing a family, a Chinese American family, and actually I found the record of the name of that person on a ship from ancestry.com. But the kind of systematic study you're talking about, I don't know if we have done it, but it's a really good thing to do. I think Asian American historians are the ones who should be doing this. And I would not be surprised that there are people thinking of doing that. Right now, you're completely relying on word of mouth. Like you said, there are a few who are 3-4 generation Japanese American, 3-4 generation Chinese. It's basically family lore. My great-grandfather came in 18 something, and that's how we know. But there's no systematic study. Although we know that, for instance, there's a G association in Houston. Most of the members of G family and the large clan came
What is G association?
G-E-E. It is also the same word in Chinese as Zhu, Z-H-U.
Okay.
C-H-U if you're from Taiwan. And I don't know how you romanize it in Singapore, but it's the same word. It's a large clan, and they claim members even though they do not have blood ties. But most of the G families came from Taishan in China.
Okay.
right? Or Kaiping, Taishan, some of the counties. So in their own records, they may have records, but no one I know has systematically done the kind of study you're talking about.
As an Asian person in America, I have always wondered, and this is a very abstract thought, should you assimilate into the mainstream culture by just quote unquote pretending to be one of the locals? And to what extent should you be holding on to your roots? And is that beneficial at all?
Mhm.
And is there some kind of calling that you simply cannot resist that is the part of you?
That's a question every single Asian in America asks him or herself. My students ask that, in college is when you really realize you start dealing with identity, whereas in high school, you just try to blend in. Um, all of our interviewees, whatever the age is, that is an essential question of existence. Who am I? What am I made of? Um, and I think that in the end, it's what you're comfortable with. I grew up in different countries, but I've always lived in the embassy. So to me, my identity is I'm Chinese, but I'm a foreigner in all these countries. I'm part of a diplomatic family, therefore I'm there as a fly on the wall, observing your society. But now that I've lived in America and I've become an American citizen, United States is no longer an observed country, but it's a country. It's home now. And then you start thinking, well, what am I comfortable with? My own solution is that I'm using English to study Chinese history. My essential question has to do with why did my family end up on Taiwan when, from everything you read, and when I was growing up, a part of my job as a diplomat's child is sometimes to go on radio station, like in Australia, to defend Taiwan and explain that Taiwan was a democratic China. Australia should continue to extend formal diplomatic relations to Taiwan because mainland China is so communist. But in the back of my mind, it would be like, oh boy, if mainland China is communist so bad, how do we end up losing mainland China, end up on Taiwan? If we're such great nationalists, why shouldn't we be on the mainland? So that led me to the study of the period early between 1900 and 1925, if you will, mainland China, when the split really occurred. So that is my identity. Basically, I'm a Chinese historian. I use English because that's a better, stronger language for me. And I'm using that to explain to American audience, if you will, what happened in China. Creating the Asian American Archive is also another way to highlight my own identity with the Asian population, but also to show how amazingly complex and varied and just wonderful the Asian community is. So that is how I resolve my existential dilemma, if you will. What am I doing here? Who am I? And so I use my strength, my language, my ties to the Asian community, my skill as a historian to do what is meaningful for me. So I don't think you need to define who you are. I think you should feel your way. If you're comfortable dating, someone of a different ethnicity, and then eventually resolve it by marrying one or the other, that's perfectly fine. If you like different kind of movies or music or food, I think a person is allowed to experiment and just become a blend. And there's no need to box yourself into one particular category. And I think that's why America is so amazing, that I'm not sure other societies will allow you to be so inventive, but I think this society allows you to be creative, and you can just say to people, this is what I want to be. And no one can say that you're wrong.
So, and I do want to get you to talk a little bit about your Houston Asian American Archive. Maybe speak a little bit about how you think about the experience of Asian Americans in the city of Houston, which I assume is what's the focus of this archive. Maybe tell us 2 or 3 examples of interesting encounters that stand out in your archiving process.
Okay, well, we began the archive when a friend of mine said her father was the publisher of the first Chinese newspaper in Houston. He's retired and there's no place to put the papers. So we took the papers to our library, archived it, and interviewed him. So that was the beginning of the archive. And very soon this gentleman, we interviewed him in July, and he died in September. And he was so proud to finally have had his contribution recorded and preserved in Rice repository. So then we realized there's a pent-up demand in the community for us to record the Asian American experience, and that extends across. And I wanted to be Pan-Asian. I did not want it just to be Chinese American. And so we started interviewing, and the community really supported the project. And so we have now gathered 300 stories, and I would say every single story is just mind-bogglingly courageous. The people are full of dignity, and despite the setbacks, many of them actually are very reluctant to talk about any kind of discrimination they suffered when clearly these 80 and 90-year-olds grew up under Jim Crow or worse, and yet they did not want to talk about it. Several stories stood out. Okay, so the G family is a typical one, and I'm going to mention again, I don't know if you know about MoCA, the Museum of Chinese American.
Yes, that's in New York. Yeah, but before you talk about MoCA though, I'm curious about that point you made about these 80, 90-year-olds refusing to talk about discrimination they suffered through. Is it a matter of, number one, it was very painful and they did not want to relive that memory? Or number two, there was such high agency, they felt they wanted to impart on future generations about pulling up by their own bootstraps and not sort of being carried away by history that's clearly not really repeating today?
I think
or something else?
Completely, absolutely right, both. It's shame. And it's also very shameful for them to feel they have been discriminated against. So they don't want to relive it because it's painful, but also they want to say, look what I am now. I want to talk about who I am now. I don't want to talk about what happened before. So it's both. So basically, I was just saying, MoCA is doing something called an Antique Roadshow-like program, and they've asked us to interview 2 of our interviewees and have them bring an artifact on a webinar, explain what happened. So I will talk about the same story, the G family. So as I mentioned earlier, the G's trickled into Houston from different parts of the US, because in Houston, children can go to school with white people, whereas in Mississippi, you were not allowed to. So many of the fathers pulled up their grocery store and came down to Houston. There are 2 patriarchs in this G Family Association. One of them, a brother, CY, and one to Chu, who had more education than others. They were actually college educated in Hong Kong, came to California, went to a school called Berkeley College, I believe. It's not the same Berkeley that we know today. Graduated, but nobody wanted to hire them. So the San Antonio Chinese grocers hired them to teach Chinese. Very soon, CY Chu realized that there's business to be made, there's money to be made in Houston. Houston was a booming oil town. So he came to Houston and started grocery stores. He asked his brother Wanto to come, and then all the Chu or G people they know who are willing to come to Houston, they will let them live sleep in their living room, give them seed money to start their grocery store and take a little percentage. And that's how a group of these Taiwanese G members came to Houston to start grocery stores. And this is in the 1950s, 40s, 50s. Another patriarch is G. Harry G. Sr. came from China, worked extremely hard in restaurants as a 14, 15-year-old in New Orleans. And by the time he was 20 or 24 or 5, he had enough money to start his own restaurant and realized that between New Orleans and Houston, Lake Charles, as we know, where the hurricane really hit, is the beginning of where the oil companies are, the refineries. So he decided that following that route, coming from Lake Charles to Houston is where the restaurant business will boom. He, again, encouraged the G family members to come, and he would allow them some seed money, and then there's a cluster of G family-owned restaurants. Harry G. Jr., the son now, is today a well-known immigration lawyer, part owner of the Texan football team. So you can tell how well they did. So Harry G., one of his restaurants in 1951 in Houston had the annual estimated sale of $500,000. So $500,000, and we're talking about these are the money that's on the books. Who knows if it's cash transaction, you don't even see it. So they're very well to do, even though you think Chinese immigrants are poor, illiterate, not at all. Their cousin, Albert G., has 2 brothers. Albert G. is a flamboyant, creative, really smart guy who opened a poly-Asian restaurant next to the Shamrock Hotel in Houston. Shamrock Hotel is where national entertainers from Hollywood would come and perform in a hotel. So poly-Asian restaurant being next door, the society columnist of the Houston newspaper would take these national entertainers and have lunch in Albert G.'s poly-Asian restaurant. Albert G, of course, probably would not charge them. So the society columnists kept on bringing in entertainers. Albert G kept on entertaining them. So very soon, he became the darling of the Houston newspaper. He was written up as a restaurateur of the year. He created something called the haute Cantonese cuisine, which never existed before. And he became the president of the Houston Restaurant Association, which is not an Asian concern. It's all over Houston. His wife, who was the first Chinese woman to attend Rice University, and her father was a wealthy and San Antonio grocer, wanted to be, and she was pre-med. She fell in love with Albert, dropped out of the university, and did not go home for 6 months. She was afraid her father would kill her. Anyway, but then very soon when her father met her husband, he was fine. So Albert G and Jane G became the darling of the circuit, and she became the president of the Women's Auxiliary of the Houston Restaurant Association. So when Richard Nixon came to Texas to visit the governor, John Connally, there was a big party, and John Connally took everybody to his ranch. Albert G and Jane G were invited. So this is my story of the upward mobility by your guile and by your wits and also by your ability. Another interesting thing is that when desegregation of the lunchroom counter happened in Texas, in Houston, the students from
what is the lunchroom encounter?
I'm sorry, lunchroom counter. I meant just room. You know how in department stores, their lunchroom, the restaurants in department stores, lunchroom, they're counters like soda fountain, and that's what lunch. So the Texas Southern University is an African American university in Houston. One day, the students in the 1960, I would say 63, I think, decided to walk out of the university, sit at a department store counter, and demanded to have lunch served. These students were well dressed, well behaved, but then the white people in the lunchroom counter and this department store called Foley closed down the counter and said, "I'm sorry, no, service is over." They refused to serve Black people. So this went on and on for several days. The city mayor called the president of the university, say, "Call your students back." The president said, "My students are exerting a civic right. I have no right to call them back. They're not doing anything bad." So then the mayor and the police chief said, "We have to solve this problem peacefully because all around the country, race riots are happening everywhere." So between the Foley's department store is where the lunchroom encounter happened. The advertising chief of Foley's department store is friends with the head of the Houston newspaper, John Jones. And so basically, and the police and the mayor, they're all friends, they're all white guys. So they say, okay, so the John Jones, the publisher of the paper, said to the Foley's department store people, "Open up your lunchroom counter. We will not publish that in the news. We will not publicize it. Open it up and we'll ensure that the police will not come. The students will behave civically and then let it happen." And then Albert G, being the head of the Houston Restaurant Association, had to run around the city and then talk to all the restaurant owners that lunchroom counters will be open. Meanwhile, he was talking to the head of the publisher of the African newspaper, the Forward Times, in the African American community, saying that if your people are coming to lunch, do it peacefully and it will happen. So this information was not public until 9 days after the fact. And an old prominent TV news personality whom you probably have not heard of, Dan Rather, he is very famous for my generation.
Yeah, I know him.
Okay, so Dan Rather was a reporter in Houston. He was vilified by his colleagues saying, "You are supposed to report news, you're not supposed to suppress news." But because of that, the lunchroom desegregation happened very peacefully in Houston. And then again, very few fighting. But the dinner and the restaurant desegregation did not happen again until another year or two later. And the same players were in place. So this is one of my stories.
So I guess Albert G played the role of coordinating with the various restaurants to allow a peaceful lunch counter.
Right. Right, because as president of the Houston Restaurant Association, that was his role. And I always kind of jokingly say it takes an Asian to mediate between black and white. So that's one story. And then the other I would say would be a situation when, you help each other. So the South Asian community, many of them came after 1965 when the immigration law relaxed and an influx of professionals came into this country. Many Indian engineers and medical personnel came in under that law. So the wife of an Indian doctor who was highly recruited to a small town in Michigan came in a culture shock. She's from Chennai, South India, and here's freezing in Michigan weather. And she lived in an apartment complex where above her there was another Indian doctor and wife. But she said that wife would come to her apartment from morning until night and not go home. And she said, I'm lonely. I have a friend where Indians are welcoming. So I never asked her why she didn't go home to her husband until months later, this friend confided that her husband was having an affair with a nurse and bringing her home, and she had nowhere to go. So this woman, her name is Lakshmi, said, I know that there are women who are abused in the South Asian community, but we are a model minority. We never talk about it. Nothing is done. So then her husband came to Houston, and she joined a club of wives of doctors, all Indian. And they talk about themselves, that they will hear XYZ being, beaten up and nobody said anything. And then she was trained in India as a social worker. And then she went to work for the Fort Bend Women's Shelter, which is a white agency for women who are abused. And she realized, Indian women are not comfortable seeking help from a white women's shelter because the language is different, the food is different, the religion is different. They just don't even feel comfortable, they don't think they'll be understood. So finally, an incident in Houston blew up where this educated Indian woman killed herself. Oh no, first of all, killed her husband, killed the 3 children, burnt a house, and then killed herself. It turned out that she's been abused for 10 or 20 years of marriage, but never told anyone. At that point, Lakshmi, the person like I'm talking about, started passing out her home numbers to any of her friends, saying, if you hear of any South Asian women abused, call me. And it began small, but now I don't know how many years it's been in existence, maybe 20 years. They now have a budget of $1 million, and they service thousands of phone calls, and they have halfway houses. They bring women out of abusive situations. They give them English lessons, driving lessons, citizen, whatever it is, go to court with them to sue their husbands. And they're doing that. And it's because this community realized that if you don't help yourself, nobody's going to help you. And your people are not comfortable going to a situation where you need a lot of cultural competency, a lot of cultural affinity, and they don't exist. So these are 2 of my stories, and I have a lot more, but I think I'm mindful of the time.
Yes, absolutely. Wow, amazing. And I also wanted to ask you about the Chen Duxiu project, if you still have time. Maybe quickly talk about what piqued your interest in it and the significance of mapping out the social network for this man.
Right. So we know that the Qing dynasty fell apart in 1911, and the Republic of China rose in 1911, if you will. But it was a tumultuous time where educational system fell apart. The old system of going triennial exam on the old classical Chinese fell apart. So China in the first century, first decade.
By the way, you said triennial, so back then it was once every 3 years?
Yes, it's that gigantic Keju system where you study, you go for an exam, and if you succeed, you get land, you get power, you get title, you get everything. If you don't succeed, you try again. That completely fell apart in 1905. And so by the time the first or second decade of the 20th century, the political system was in flux because it's not that easy to start a republic system having been a dynasty. So there were warlords, there were dictators. And the cultural system fell apart. You're no longer studying classical Chinese for the exam. You are suddenly faced with studying in a vernacular Chinese, colloquial Chinese, and then you are also studying information from abroad that was never available. So the man I studied, Chen Duxiu, grew up at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, and he, as a youngster, rebelled against the entire classical studies exam. He went to Japan and realized, studying in Japan, you could study Montesquieu, John Stuart Mills, you can study Marx, you can study everything that you were not allowed to study in China, right? The political philosophies, the socioeconomic system, all of that. So he came back to China and wrote this extremely influential journal called The New Youth that basically influenced generations of Chinese, including Xin Qingnian, including Zhou Enlai, who actually was a young communist cadre with him in his party. But Zhou Enlai, when Kissinger visited him in 1970s, was still reciting a poem that Chen Duxiu wrote in New Youth. That is how powerful Chen Duxiu was. So he taught at the Beijing University, and he invited many of the professors to be editors of the New Youth magazine. At that point, Hu Shi, who we also know as famous Chinese intellectual, was a professor, a colleague of his, and they were all friends. But then when the 1918, the end of World War I, It was a treaty in Paris called the Treaty of Versailles, where China had hoped that by entering the war on the side of the of the winners, if you will, that the land that was taken over by Germany, Qingdao, that island, was a German protectorate at the time. Since Germany lost World War One, it would return to China. Especially President Woodrow Wilson had said that he is allowing all countries who had been suppressed to have self-determination. But what the Chinese did not know, including the diplomats who were negotiating in Paris, is that the warlord government in China, the Beiyang government, had already sold Qingdao basically to Japan in exchange for a huge loan. The money was used to wage civil war because the Beiyang government was trying to fight the South. And so they felt very betrayed. And then when the news came back to China from Paris, that the Chinese diplomats and the US diplomats could not help get Qingdao back to China, but it had gone to Japan because the Chinese government signed away the rights. This erupted in China and created what was called the May 4th demonstration. So professors and students of Peking University and the surrounding schools in Beijing staged a march on Tiananmen Square, went to the home of the Chinese diplomats, burned their house, and protest against the US embassy, trying to tell the world and the country, if we as intellectuals do not come and save our country, we're completely going to fall apart and lose. So this is called the May 4th movement. But what led up to the May 4th movement were young students and intellectuals who were fired up about democracy, about fighting against Confucian tradition, to take away all the fetters against family, against the kind of authoritarian family social structure. This kind of cultural upheaval was created because of the New Youth magazine and other magazines like that. So Chen Duxiu was extremely influential at the time. Mao Zedong called him the general marshal of the May 4th movement. So when news came back that democracy cannot help, the US democracy, any other democratic system still could not help China. At the same time, Russian government came in and said, we as the Bolsheviks will renounce all the Tsarist treaties that were signed by the Tsarist government with China. We will return to you the money that we were taking away from you. We're going to give you help and we will renounce all the territory claims the Tsarist government had claimed. So all of a sudden, the disillusionment with the Western democratic world turned into hope for the socialist system offered by the Bolshevik government. And that is when the Russian communist international agents came to China looking for partners to start a communist party. And Chen Duxiu was highly recommended by many people because he started writing about complementary things about the socialist system. So he started the Chinese Communist Party with Li Dazhao, a theoretician. And then eventually, as history rolled on, he got kicked out of the Communist Party. But so from 1910 to 1920, to me, is really interesting in China because his good friend Hu Shi disagreed with him. He did not think that socialism was the right system for China. He stayed with the nationalist government more or less, even though he was highly critical and was an independent voice. But this is when these intellectuals split into two forces. And then, as we know from history, the communists won, the national Chinese lost. But even during the next 20 or 30 years, when these political fighting was going on everywhere, these intellectuals remained their friendship. Chen Duxiu was jailed, and he died eventually. After jail, he died destitute. In jail, he was of ill health. His friends from the nationalist side, kept on sending him medicine, kept on trying to help him. And when he left jail, Mao Zedong said to him, if you repent, admit your mistakes, we'll take you back to the Communist Party. His friends on the Kuomintang side said, Chiang Kai-shek wants you to be one of his advisors on his committee, and he refused both for many different reasons. But he died destitute, and his friends from the Beijing University Alumni Association, from Hu Shi, kept on sending a little bit of money at a time because Chen Duxiu refused to get a lot of money. So to me, this is fascinating that why we are here today basically was determined in 1920. Mapping as network is interesting because I'm curious. Chen Duxiu was a classically trained scholar. Yes, he was temperamentally rebellious, but how did he become the founder of the Communist Party? And I mapped out his student unions when he joined in Japan, if you will, the social organizations he joined. When he returned to Shanghai, he was tapped by many of the famous revolutionaries in China in those days to start writing newspapers with them. Cai Yuanpei, who was the president of Peking University, was with Chen Duxiu in a Shanghai assassination squad that they created. These intellectuals created an anarchist organization. They hired a chemistry professor from a high school to teach them how to make bombs. I mean, as unrealistic as you are, but this is how they behave in those days. And so from one circle to another, he went from a local intellectual to a provincial intellectual of some renown, and he published a newspaper in Anhui. And then he became a national figure because he joined these people making bombs, and then Cai Yuanpei invited him to Peking University to publish and to teach. So by tracing his social mapping, if you will, you can somewhat understand how a person went from point A to point B.
Wow, amazing, amazing. Yeah, I always knew that he played a pivotal role in the founding of the Communist Party. I was not aware of the whole backdrop and the influence that his magazine had on his generation of people that started the May 4th movement that we commemorate today still in China. Well, Anne, thank you very much for coming on my show. I feel very privileged to have a historic tutor almost from a prestigious university. So thank you very much for this one-on-one.
Thank you so much. You asked very good questions, and best luck on your show.
Thank you, Anne. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.